Peter. Thank you. Thank you. I'm starting with Professor Porter from Harvard University. And it was Professor Porter, 22 years ago now, who came out with the competitive advantage of nations. A bit of a misnomer in the title of the book. Yes, it's the competitive advantage of nations, but one of Porter's key findings here was that strong companies are based within regions alongside other related companies. Strong companies were not isolated, they were clustered. I'm building in part on Porter's work. I'm building in part on what The Economist magazine more recently described as, or highlighted as, few economic development policies are as popular as clusters. Hard today to find a country, a region, a city, anywhere in the world that isn't in some way engaged in a practical way in understanding and in building on its clusters. I'm building in part on this slide, and this was taken 3-4 weeks ago in Copenhagen. This is from one of the senior policy advisors in Brussels, talking at a conference in Copenhagen maybe 4 weeks ago. Key objectives of EU cluster policy. Firstly, to assist regions in building their clusters, particularly in building their clusters to support small businesses. So a practical tool for small business engagement. And the second point he's making on this slide, a lot of EU support now going into linking related clusters across Europe. Linking related clusters such as IT clusters, such as horticultural clusters, such as clean tech clusters. And linking related clusters to build the business-to-business connections, but also to build the academic-to-academic connections. So a lot of funding from Brussels going in now to support cluster-to-cluster development. So what is a cluster? Let me start in taking you to a little place in Australia. And I'm using this example in honor of, I think this is the first cluster that's under development here in the Ukraine. It's apples. And making this point, this is a place with a population of 1,700. Every Australian, most Australians know that this is the place you go to for quality apples. It's a place that has an Australian-wide reputation. So using this as a first example of geographic clustering with a particular specialization, here, apples. But let me take you to the south of France. I want to take you to Provence, where lavender grows, and a wide range of other crops grow that are particularly ingredients for the perfume industry. Grasse has a population of 25,000 people. It's small, but it's able to call itself the world capital for perfumes. This is the place particularly where the perfume oil is distilled. Some of the raw material, like the lavender, is grown locally. Others is sourced from wherever in the world. But if you're in the perfume oil business, you know about Grasse. Perfume needs packaging. It needs bottles. And I want to take you to a place in the north of France, Bresley. Again, it's not that big. Maybe 40,000 people live in Bresley. This is where 3/4 of the world's perfume bottles are made. Again, an example of a local specialization that has come through over time. It's a place that used to make beer bottles, wine bottles, but now particularly makes the more expensive, the technically more complex, the more fashionable perfume bottles. Where do the perfume bottles and the raw material come together? It's here in Chartres, a place that today calls itself Cosmetics Valley. A place with some 200 cosmetic firms that are co-located. And they're co-located not because there's subsidies, not because there's government grants. They're co-located because it makes commercial sense for them to be there. Because that's where the knowledge infrastructure is, in part with 4 universities that are integral part of this cluster. In part, it's where the specialist suppliers are, it's where the specialist marketing people are, the specialist PR people. So describing a third cluster here in France that stands out on a world scale. I've taken you, with a little bit of speed, into 3 clusters in France. I could take you into a large number of others. Others where each locality has worked through, what are we really good at doing? What is our strength? What is it that gives us an edge in our community? And then understanding, how do we work as a team around that specialization, around that activity? Let me jump from France to Norway. Norway, on the edge of the North Sea, stands out in particular for subsea technology. That's their specialization. I was recently in Darwin, Australia, which is exploring the offshore oil fields. In the hotel I was staying in, there were many Norwegians coming from Bergen. This is the global hotspot for subsea technology today. It's a naturally occurring cluster. Over 100 companies are part of it, but there is also a cluster organization, a clustering initiative. A clustering initiative with 10-year funding, public funding, and private funding in place. So public funding in part because the Norwegian government is saying cluster development is not quick fix. It's long-term engagement. So let's commit, let's lock in for long-term engagement in working with this cluster. It's an initiative that is particularly understanding, how do we keep moving the agenda forward? What's next? So an agenda that is looking at where do we go to from here, an agenda that is understanding how do we engage as a team to get there. Because the realization here, as in the other clusters I'm taking you to, that reaching a higher plateau needs teamwork. You can't do it with a series of solo operators. It needs teamwork, it needs trust. These are the companies in Bergen, Norway. Companies that compete, and that's healthy. But companies that have also worked through, where might we collaborate? Where might we work as a team? And that's healthy too. And a word that I often use here is co-opetition. And I'll take you into co-opetition a little bit more later. If I look at the university in Bergen, this is, I think, the only place in the world where you can do a degree in subsea technology and underwater technology. That's part of the specialization of this community, and they attract students from around the world. Let me go a little bit further north in Norway to Bodo. Bodo, way up by the Arctic Circle. Population, 40,000. Again, small place. Bodo can call itself the salmon farming capital of the world. And I like the way they describe their cluster in saying, yes, it's the fish farming, it's the fish processing, but it's also the feed production, it's the technology, particularly the engineering firms, it's the health, the environment, it's the research, it's the training, it's the advisory, it's the financial institutions who are all, and it hasn't come easy for them, but have all found a way, how do we work as a team? In a way, how do we work as a team to bake a bigger pie? Because if we can bake a bigger pie, then it's going to be a lot easier to slice that pie. As in Bergen, there is a university here, and a university where you can go to do a PhD today in English, in aquaculture, marine ecology, sustainable management. So again, describing specialist faculties, specialist activities at the university that relate to the core wealth-creating activity of this small community. But staying in Norway, they've taken the same approach to tourism. and a number of tourism clusters under development across Norway. I want to share with you one example, their mountain tourism cluster, as they call it. It's 7 different regions that have been, with difficulty, attracting winter skiers, winter tourism people from Germany, from the UK, in part because of the unpronounceable names that these places have got. They're engaged as a team and describing their cluster as, yes, it's the core businesses, but it is also the public authorities. It's also the knowledge institutions, the training institutions. It's also the high schools that are working within this cluster, engaged as a team to bake a bigger pie, to put this place even more firmly on the European tourism map. I'm still in Scandinavia, in northern Sweden here, and want to take you to a place that is a global hotspot. Has anybody heard of this place? Let me share with you what goes on here. This is winter car testing. It's the #1 place in the world for winter car testing. This is where the Japanese go, this is where BMW go, this is where Porsche go, this is where the whole world, the whole automotive world goes in the middle of winter to test their vehicles, to test their new products, their new services. And what I see around the world are places that have developed, often over 10, 20, 30 years, even more, developed a particular specialization, initially to service the local market, and then the country, then the region, and often then the world. So showing here IT, or if I drill down in Europe, IT activities across Europe are not evenly spread. There are a number of communities, a number of places that particularly stand out. I've taken you into a number of clusters, looking from clusters out to the world. Another way of looking at it is as an international buyer. And if you're a buyer, and I'd like to be a buyer of a Formula 1 racing car, but I haven't quite got the budget. But if I was a buyer, where would I go? And perhaps there's only one place in the world, a place known as Motorsport Valley, just north of Heathrow in England. It's the world mecca for motorsport racing. If, as the World Health Organization was doing 18 months ago, looking for a solution to the Ebola virus, where did they go to? There were just 3 places in the world that they looked to. One of them was Lyon in France. If you were looking to buy radish seeds, and radish seeds, help me on the Ukrainian word here. Okay, so these little salad vegetables, half the world's radish seeds come from a little corner in New Zealand. And I'm describing the way the world is working here from a buyer's perspective and saying it's becoming a lot simpler. You don't need to go to too many places anymore. And a question then for the regions across Ukraine is, what do we stand out in? What are we really good at doing? Because the days of doing a little bit of everything have gone. So what is our deep specialization? What are we really, really good at doing? Whether it's apples or whether it's some aspect of IT or whether it's winter tourism, what are we good at doing? And describing here globalization and localization, 2 sides of the same coin. The world is global, which means in part the rest of the world can now reach into our home country. So what are we going to offer in return? Certainly low-cost freight, easier access, makes it easier to service the global market, even from a remote country like New Zealand. But in order to do that, you've got to have the deep competencies, the deep specializations that I'm sharing and taking you into these different clusters around the world. A firm that is located in one of the sort of clusters that I've been describing is quite simply more competitive, more successful, grows quicker than similar firms that are scattered across the country. The evidence is pretty clear from work from Harvard University, from work from the EU, from work that USAID has done in a number of countries, from work that the World Bank has done in a number of developing economies across the world. The evidence is clear. Strong companies tend to be co-located. From an economic development perspective, the evidence is also pretty clear that these clusters generate more employment. They pay higher wages. There's more productivity. There's more innovation. There's more startups in particular coming through with a strong probability of success, because it is an ecosystem, an environment that supports those startups. The specialist suppliers are there, the bank managers that can relate to that economic activity are co-located. There's evidence such as this coming out of EU work in looking at the correlation between the number of employees in strong clusters in a region and average incomes in the region. Again, clear evidence showing the power of clusters, the economic power of clusters. For Brussels today, a key word is smart specialization. I like the term, with Brussels encouraging each of the regions within Europe to work through what exactly are your smart specializations? What are you good at doing? And one of the keys in addressing smart specializations is understanding the patterns of clusters within the regional community. I've taken you into a number of European places. I could take you into Canada, a city like Montreal, city perhaps just a little bit smaller than Kiev. This is their economic development strategy. It's centered on these clusters. These are the core activities that pull wealth into Montreal. And what Montreal has done, no different to many other communities, is work through, in terms of economic development, what are the activities, the economic activities that just service the local market? Because all of us, we need hairdressers, we need car repair people, we need house builders. But that is the side servicing the domestic market. What is the second side is the traded side of the economy, the activities that are pulling in wealth from beyond the region. And that is where Montreal is focusing and engaging on these 7-8 clusters. What makes a strong cluster tick? What makes a strong cluster successful? And thinking of 4 dimensions here, this culture, we need the rivalry, but we also need the cooperation. Co-opetition, the word that I used. The customers, particularly the demanding customers, the customers that continue to put pressure on our businesses, the customers that are never satisfied. The suppliers, the quality of suppliers, perhaps in an Apple cluster, the quality of the packaging suppliers, the quality of the transport infrastructure, the quality of the chilled, the chilled freight distribution network. And fourthly, the inputs. I can take that a little bit further and introduce what Porter at Harvard called the diamond. I'm looking for my little, oh, there we go. The diamond, and if you Google Porter's diamond, you will pick up a lot on this. Again, the quality of the demand conditions, the related, the supporting, such as the transport infrastructure, the inputs, the factor conditions, perhaps the technical training, the R&D. It could be factor conditions at a high school level as well as at a university level. And finally, a context that particularly encourages differentiation amongst those firms, where competition is based not on price, but on differentiation from others. As I look at strong clusters, one of the key things I look for is the quality of social capital, the quality of engagement, the quality of trust. Is this a cluster like this, or is it a more open innovation system? And often a key determinant between the clusters that are really strong, the overachievers and the underachievers, is that there is this social capital, there is this trust. but it takes time to build the trust. It takes time, particularly in a cluster perhaps where there's a number of apple growers, pack houses, fierce competitors that have difficulty in sitting in the same room together. 2 dimensions to cluster development: reaching in, building the connections, building this culture of co-opetition, getting alignment of support organizations, training organizations, export agencies, investment attraction agencies. Getting that alignment doesn't come easy. And secondly, reaching out, building the pipelines to pull in customers, to pull in new investment, to pull in new talent, to pull in new ideas, to pull in new knowledge. So 2 key dimensions here: the reaching in, the connections, the reaching out. I mentioned that every single EU country has got some form of cluster program in place. In Germany at the national level, but also each Länder, each region is engaged in understanding and building its regional clusters. 4 key principles in cluster development: businesses in the lead, businesses setting the pace, businesses particularly influential in setting the agenda, public agencies coming through in support, and public agencies plural. So even though a public agency might be the prime funder of a clustering initiative, I'm arguing here that strong initiatives are business-led, business-driven, knowledge underpinning, and thirdly, emphasizing once more the teamwork, the co-opetition culture. I want to drill down on this word co-opetition and share this example with you. This is a place in northern Italy that used to have trees. It's moved from trees to sawmilling, to furniture and building products, and now particularly chairs. That's their specialization. But it's no longer chairs just in wood, it's chairs in plastic, as we have here, it's chairs in metal. The raw material is no longer important. This isn't a place with 1 or 2 large companies. There are some 1,200 chair manufacturers in this place. Only some 20% of those firms export. So what do 80% of the firms do? And this is one of the keys to productivity here. It's one of the keys to productivity in any cluster. Most of the firms are making just a component for a chair. Some firms are preparing plastic or preparing wool. Some firms are making wheels for chairs. Some firms are working in metal. Other firms are still working in wood. Some firms working in different forms of plastic. So describing a community with very flexible specialization, a community where firms come together, different firms, for a particular project, for a particular customer. Maybe the 4 of us are working together for Holiday Inn, and perhaps I'm working with you guys in making chairs for Starbucks. So describing flexible arrangements, describing here lots of small businesses that separately are vulnerable, but wow, together they have critical mass. Describing a culture where these firms fight, as they fight in a Silicon Valley, but they've also got the ability to work through where might we work together, such as on a common contract. So a culture of co-opetition, a culture that can also be seen in Chicago with these 6 ladies. They make hats for weddings, expensive hats. They realized that they'd separately turned down a large order, saying, I just can't make it. These are micro businesses. Most of these ladies are working in the basements of the houses. They realized they'd turned down a large order, and then one of them thought, you know, together we could have done that. Together we could have addressed that order. They work together when there's large orders. One of them speaks French, goes to Paris twice a year. She buys their linens, their fine silks. So they buy together, they engage on large orders together, but fundamentally, they're competitors. And that is healthy. That's the culture of co-opetition that I'm talking about. I want to take you, as my final example, to a place in the desert in Australia. It's a mining town, a number of engineering firms. Some 25 engineering firms are part of this cluster. But there's also this network now for just 3 of those firms, where they're collaborating particularly to pull in business from beyond their small town. So collaborating to make things happen that separately they couldn't do. I'm describing here a firm as being boundaryless. Being boundaryless because it can pull in other resources, it can access other capabilities in order to address new business opportunities, rather than trying to do everything within its own organization. I'm describing in part a move away from vertically integrated standalone firms to more flexible arrangements amongst firms, with firms combining forces where needed. My last story takes you to Iceland. 3 clusters under development in Iceland: oceans, geothermal, tourism. This is the oceans cluster. It's bringing together education, training, the fish processing, the logistics. It's the marketing, it's the aquaculture, it's the tourism, it's the ocean science. Again, a wide range of players. It is in part linking in with similar initiatives across Europe, even linking in now with initiatives in Newfoundland and in Canada. So saying in part, a cluster is not a tidy box. A cluster is not a self-contained system. It needs to link in with others. One of their initiatives is an incubator, but it's an incubator just for ocean-related companies. If you make furniture, this is not for you. This is just for people involved in adding value to fish or in fish technology, fish processing machinery. So describing, again, the specialization that I see in many different parts of the world, not a general incubator, an incubator just for a specific sector, a specific cluster. Professor Porter was in Reykjavik 2010, and these were his recommendations. Need to strengthen the business environment, particularly openness to foreign investment, competition. Need to deepen and upgrade the clusters, and then from that, build the national economic strategy. And I'm using this slide from Iceland, saying perhaps what is needed here in Ukraine is very similar. Certainly, we need to address the general business environment, and corruption is one element there. We need to understand what are our regional clusters, and then build up from that what is the national strategy. To summarize, the evidence from around the world is clear. Regions that are home to dynamic clusters and to companies that are rooted, companies that are grounded in those clusters, companies that say, this is home. The evidence is clear that such clusters, such companies do better on a global scale.